In this lesson, I'm going to demonstrate how to create an exception object and then how to throw that exception once the exception object has been created. So to start with, the first thing we need to do is bring in a header into our program. And that header is std_except, which stands for the standard exception header. We're going to be creating a exception class, a derived class, that is based on one of the standard C++ exceptions, runtime error. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So we're going to create a exception class called divide_by_0, and it inherits from, as I mentioned earlier, one of the standard C++ exception classes, runtime error, because the divide_by_0 error is indeed a runtime error. Our class definition is very simple. We have just a public section, and then all we have is a constructor. And that constructor only performs one task, and that's to call the constructor for the base class, runtime error, and pass in a message that we want to be displayed when we try to divide by 0, and that message is divide_by_0 exception. So that's all the class has to do, and all a divide_by_0 object has to do is when it's been called, or when it's thrown, it has to display the message divide_by_0 exception so that the user will know what's wrong. So that's all we need for our class definition. Now let's create a situation where this exception can be thrown. And we're going to do that by creating a function called quotient, which will take two parameters, a numerator and a denominator. The function then checks to see if the denominator is equal to 0. If it is, then we want to throw a divide_by_0 exception. And the way we do that is we use the keyword throw and then call the constructor for our divide_by_0 class. And at that point, if the denominator is equal to 0, then the divide_by_0 exception will be thrown. Otherwise, we want to return the numerator divided by the denominator. Very simple. And that's all there is to it. So let's review what we've learned in this lesson. We can create our own exception objects. We do that by deriving our exception object from one of the standard C++ exception classes. And so if we want to create our own exception object, we're going to have to include the header std_except. Then our exception class will derive from one of these standard exception classes. In this case, we're using runtime error. You can look up in a C++ reference what the other standard exceptions are. Then all our class has to do is have a constructor that calls the base class constructor with a customized message indicating what exception is being thrown. In this case, it's a divide_by_0 exception. Then to throw the exception, we simply need to test for a condition that would lead to that exception. For divide_by_0, that means the denominator has to be equal to 0. When and if that condition occurs, then we throw the exception by using the keyword throw followed by a call to the constructor for our exception class. And that's all there is to it. We're now ready to move to the next lesson where we're going to demonstrate what to do with an exception when it's been thrown, which is to catch the exception so that the program doesn't crash. And we're going to see how to do that in the next lesson.